In this video I want to talk about one of my favorite movies of the last 15 years, which is No Country for Old Men. And I think it is safe to say that some of you, after viewing the movie for the first time, have asked themselves, who is this character Anton Chigurh and what does he represent in the story? And I'll tell you right away that the movie makes many allusions or treats Chigurh as if he was the Angel of Death, the Grim Reaper, or however you would like to call the anthropomorphic entity known as Death. By this I don't mean to exclude other interpretations, because I think that the movie is so masterfully crafted that it allows for many valid interpretations of the same character, story and themes. And I think that the fact that it lends itself so well to many different interpretations is definitely one of the reasons why me and others think that No Country for Old Men is truly a great movie. But enough about that, and let us return to the Grim Reaper, also known as Anton Chigurh. I think the most obvious and recurring allusion to Chigurh being a personification of death lies in the act of seeing, whether a character has seen him or not. We know from many folktales, stories and religious texts that the appearance of death signals the death of those who are able to see death. They may not die at the first encounter, but they will definitely die in the foreseeable future. And there is an interesting passage in Psalm 89:48 of the Targum, the Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible, and which says the following: "There is no man who lives and, seeing the angel of death, can deliver his soul from his hand." The question of whether someone has seen Chigurh comes up many times in the movie. And pretty much all those who have seen him and are directly or indirectly related to the drug money do die in the movie. The deputy sees him and dies. The Mexicans see him and die. The man in the office sees him and dies as well. You could say it has nothing to do with them seeing him, but consider this. Carson Wells explicitly wonders that Moss has seen Chigurh and that he didn't die because of it. Earlier, Wells had stated that he had seen Chigurh last year in November, and Wells, who has admittedly seen him, dies later in the movie. Llewellyn Moss doesn't die during the first encounter because if you pay close attention to the scene, you will notice that he never actually sees Chigurh while Chigurh is trying to kill him. Only at the end of the scene does he see Chigurh, but the point of view shot doesn't give us or Moss a clear view of Chigurh, and later in the hospital, Moss says that he sort of saw him, so he didn't really see him. We had a clear view of Chigurh earlier, but this was not the point of view of Moss. And in the transcendental meaning of the story, his view of Chigurh wasn't clear enough to discern what he looked like, which saved him for the time being, but he is already doomed because he has laid eyes on death. He doesn't directly die through Chigurh, but he does die after having seen him, as if the sight of Chigurh had marked him for death. Sheriff Bell doesn't die near the end of the movie because he doesn't find, or rather doesn't see Chigurh during that scene in the motel. If sight wasn't a deciding factor in who lives or dies, then the fate of the accountant wouldn't depend on the question of whether he does or doesn't see Chigurh. Chigurh's question makes much more sense if we take this context into consideration. This also provides a second meaning to Chigurh's short interaction with the boys near the end of the movie. In this context, Chigurh telling the boys not to tell anyone that they have seen him becomes his real gift of gratitude for helping him, and not the money, because otherwise we know by now that he would have to kill them. But the connection between the act of seeing and death is not only limited to Chigurh. Moss looks through a scope to try to deliver death to his prey, and he later uses his binoculars to spot the dead drug dealer. Chigurh sees a drug dealer in the mirror before he is about to kill him. And Sheriff Bell looks from the same sofa at the same TV set that Chigurh had looked at earlier and whom we have established as a representation of death. There are probably more details like this, but just let me tell you to pay close attention to how often words or actions are used in the movie that are related to seeing things. There are other references to Chigurh being death. When asked how dangerous Chigurh is, Wells' answer is,
"Compared to what? The bubonic plague?"
The bubonic plague is an interesting choice because the bubonic plague was also known as the Black Death. And according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the legend of the Grim Reaper as we know it today seems to have first appeared during that exact same time period that the plague was ravaging Europe. Chigurh's weapon of choice, the kettle gun, can also be seen as a reference to the Grim Reaper. The Grim Reaper uses a scythe, an instrument which is usually used to harvest crops, only that in this case it is used to harvest souls. The harvesting aspect is maintained by the kettle gun in a sense because it is used to harvest cattle, and Chigurh therefore harvests the lives of his targets. Earlier I mentioned the Angel of Death, and this may not be the intended purpose, but it is worth considering. Chigurh strangles his first victim while both are lying on the floor. The desperate and struggling deputy leaves skid marks on the floor, which we could maybe regard as some kind of twisted snow angel. Only that here it would be the Angel of Death. Combine this with Chigurh's ecstatic look as if he was undergoing a mystical, spiritual or religious experience. If nothing else, it shows us that Chigurh's job means more to him than just the paycheck. I find that another fitting similarity between Chigurh and the Grim Reaper is his outfit. The Reaper is often depicted as wearing black or dark clothes, and Chigurh doesn't dress up too cheerfully either. And he may not be pale, but he could definitely use a stroll in the sun once in a while. The coins that Chigurh sometimes uses are reminiscent of a famous motif, which is death playing chess. The most famous depictions probably being the 15th century painting by Albertus Pictor and the Swedish movie classic The Seventh Seal from Ingmar Bergman. In The Seventh Seal, death grants the knight Antonius Block the chance to save his life if he wins in a game of chess against him. And although it is purely up to chance if someone lives or dies in the case of the coin toss, at least Chigurh gives his targets a last chance to save themselves by playing a game, much like death does in The Seventh Seal. So Chigurh could be a representation of death, but to what purpose, you may ask? Initially I wanted to analyze this by linking it to the areas of philosophy which are called existentialism and absurdism. But since I am not too well versed in philosophy other than reading the occasional works of the best known philosophers, I did not try to force connections, but rather take some of the dilemmas mentioned there and see how they fit. Correct me in the comments if I am wrong somewhere along the way. At the center of it all is the character of Sheriff Bell, who is trying to make sense of the world around him. He knows that times have changed, which is visually underlined by the dawn of a new day when the movie begins. Something new is created or coming in those images. But unfortunately, the new age that this dawn introduces begins with Chigurh, and from hindsight we know that this is the dawn of something terrible and unfathomable in nature. I only read the first 20 pages so far, and I don't want to mix up the two, but given the context that I talked about so far, I think it is interesting to tell you that in the novel, Bell unintentionally describes Chigurh as a prophet of destruction. In the opening monologue, Bell talks about a teen who killed his 14-year-old date, and who did it just for the joy of doing it, and no other reason. And that is what Bell cannot understand. That someone can be killed or die for no apparent or compelling reason. That the murder is not necessarily linked to the victim, other than the bad luck to be at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person. In philosophy, the fact that death or bad things cannot be foreseen or avoided has been the starting point for many philosophical discussions of how to live your life in the face of such a terrible possibility. And this is what depresses Bell, because he doesn't know an answer to it. Before the Enlightenment, people could always resort to God to help them cope with the wanton death and destruction in the world. And near the end, Bell admits that he kind of hoped that God would step into his life somehow, and probably not to show him how to live a good life, but to help him to make sense of it all. But God did not enter Bell's life, and this has left him alone with an insoluble riddle. Like the philosophers, Bell is now aware of the nature of life and death, and even if he doesn't speak it out, he must know or fear now that life and death are without meaning or reason. By this he becomes a tragic or absurd character because he is now aware of a world without meaning, as well as his impotency to do anything about it or to adapt to it. He feels frightened by the abyss that lies before him, and his reaction is to go into hiding by retiring. What does this have to do with Chigurh? Well, Chigurh is the perfect embodiment of this philosophical dilemma. He doesn't only kill the good people, but also the bad people, and those who are completely unrelated to the plot. He is an unstoppable and inscrutable force, much like death, that doesn't spare anyone, and he remains a mystery to everyone in the movie. The people he encounters try to understand him or to reason with him, but they try to find a reason and meaning in something that has no solution and defies all experience. If there is a meaning to death, it lies beyond man's capabilities to understand it. Chigurh has motives that go beyond his assignment to get drug money, but nobody knows what they are. I also think that Chigurh sometimes acts as an agent of other philosophical beliefs, which are determinism and fatalism. Fatalism more or less means that there is an unavoidable destiny, and determinism means that there is an effect to every cause. And although he doesn't openly state it, he sometimes acts and talks as if he believed in those two principles, or is at least aware of the existence and possible accuracy. For example, he tells the shop owner that the coin toss is the result of his life, even though he didn't know it, making it sound like determinism. And he also tells him that the coin is from 1958 and traveled all this time to arrive at that exact moment as if it were predestined to be this way, as in fatalism. Coming back to Bell, I would say that he represents our fear of the absoluteness of death, but the results of Chigurh's deeds make it impossible for him to ignore it. And on a side note, Moss may represent our foolishness in trying to beat or outsmart death. And so the story is about Chigurh inadvertently forcing Bell and us to come to terms with our own mortality and to accept it, as Bell does reluctantly by the end of the movie. To conclude this analysis, I will talk about No Country for Old Men as a Western. I had my problems with viewing it as a Western, but changed my mind recently because it might very well be a deconstruction of the typical Western. Classical Westerns were often plays of morality, and the boundaries between good and bad were always clear for the most part. It also often was the triumph of order over chaos or rule of force. The disrupting forces always stood outside of society and were out in the open. Everyone knew who the bad guys were and how to find them. Chigurh defies all of this, and Bell and his old ways are incapable of finding him, much less stopping him, because the villains now live and act inside society. They only show themselves long enough to cause violence and death and then disappear again. The law has a much harder time in bringing them to justice, and it is also incapable of protecting anyone. Bell and the simple-minded deputy are the last remnants of the Old West. The next generation, represented by Llewellyn Moss, is no longer pure. Moss isn't a bad guy, of course, and he certainly has the determination and capabilities of classical Western protagonists, but he ultimately acts and dies because of greed and not for a higher cause. Former Western heroes could be flawed or shunned by society because of their violent tendencies, but their violence always served to protect or reclaim the greater good, and therefore, at least in part, redeemed their negative traits. But here, if Moss had survived at the end of the movie, his success wouldn't have benefited anyone but himself and his wife. Maybe this is why the movie denies us the classical showdown between the good and the bad guys, and it punishes Moss in the most absurd way. His death is absurd because it doesn't happen the way Moss and the audience would expect it to happen. We expect Chigurh, but what we get are the Mexicans. We know that the Mexicans are after him as well, but they aren't presented as even half as deadly or competent as Chigurh. It occurs somewhat out of left field, but this resonates thematically with how the nature of death is portrayed in the movie through Chigurh, even though he doesn't have anything to do with the death of Moss. Moss doesn't act out of any superior morals, and therefore the movie denies to glorify his death by refusing to show it, as opposed to movies like The Wild Bunch or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, in which we are explicitly shown how the protagonists die. The unpredictable and inscrutable nature of death and the egotistical motivations of the protagonists deny us to learn any moral lessons, which is an important part of classical westerns. The only thing that Bell can do is to acknowledge this. There is no hope for the generations after him, and therefore his own mortality marks the end of the Old West, because simpletons like his deputy are certainly no match for people like Chigurh. And people like Moss do not deserve to win because they ultimately desire what the criminals desire, which is money. And therefore this has become No Country for Old Morals. And now it's time for a short bonus round to support the claim that No Country for Old Men is a Western. While I was editing this video, my niece noticed the door frame in this image, which made her think that I was again referencing the movie The Searchers, which I didn't, because I hadn't even noticed it. But well, that door frame has been recited in many movies, and I take this as evidence for No Country for Old Men being a western. If you enjoyed this analysis, maybe you would like to watch my short analyses on 2001: Space Odyssey, The Searchers, and my longer ones on Rocky and Conan the Barbarian. I don't know when, but the next video will probably be on Lawrence of Arabia. Thank you for watching this video and see you next time.